Okay, hey everybody, it's Hayes Davis, the host of what is becoming an Uncharted Territory podcast, I suppose. So we're working on that, and not just a newsletter now. But I'm really excited today because we're going to talk about segmentation. We've got a segmentation expert with us. So I want to introduce Grant Hefler. He's an executive consultant at SBI. And I'll let Grant introduce himself and SBI, but this is work that he does every day, and he's going to have a bunch of tips and things that we can learn from him. So, Grant, you want to jump in and go?
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for having me on, Hayes. And yeah, so my name is Grant Hefler. As Hayes mentioned, I'm with SBI. So we're a go-to-market strategy and execution firm, and our whole goal is to accelerate our clients down the path towards sustainable, profitable growth. We do that through our four main service lines. So we have our consulting, our advisory, our training, and technology service lines. And we're really focused on helping solve and address the four key growth dependencies, is how we like to describe it. So all of our clients face them and have to address them at some point, but it's the growth strategy, their operating model, their commercial talent, and then data and insights, obviously being key topic in today's world. We at SBI, we primarily work with B2B SaaS companies that are private equity backed, usually between about 1 million and 1 billion in revenue. However, we do work with public companies as well. But in terms of me, I've been with SBI for about 2 years now. Like you mentioned, I do a lot of segmentation work, especially with this time of year when annual planning is coming around. It is a large chunk of the work that we actually do at SBI. So definitely a topical conversation for today.
Awesome. Well, let's jump into it. I want to start with maybe a little bit of definition and clarification. So I talk to a lot of RevOps leaders, a lot of sales leaders, and one of the questions I ask sometimes is, well, what's your segmentation? And, usually I get something along the lines of, oh, we've got, enterprise is so-and-so employee count, mid-market is this, maybe there's some verticals thrown in, something like that. But it kind of gets a little bit lost in translation sometimes about really what segmentation is and how it relates to, I think, related concepts like TAM, SAM, SOM analysis, ICP, even territory design. So maybe let's start with what seems like a simple question. What's the purpose of segmentation? And then how does it relate to all those other things that kind of circle around?
Yeah, for sure. No, I think when people hear segmentation, a lot of folks think of like market segmentation. So just identifying, like you said, the TAM, the SAM, the SOM, and it's a bit different than that. It's a bit more granular, right? So account segmentation, it's right in the name. Everything is at the account level. So really, the purpose of it addresses like three key things. It's your strategy, your prioritization, and then also your resource allocation. And so through account segmentation, you can understand who is actually buying your solutions and who you should focus your go-to-market strategy around from a customer-based perspective. You could do that through the ideal customer profile and potential, which I'm sure we'll get into here in a little bit. Second, like I said, your prioritization. So you're able to prioritize your existing customer base and your prospect base at the account level to say, hey, who should we go after first? Who do we most likely have the chance to win with, and who actually has the most money to spend on our solutions? And then given that, you can then therefore properly allocate your resources against that market opportunity. So it's, hey, look, there's, maybe millions of dollars of potential out there, and we have a finite number of resources. How do we optimize how we allocate them against the market opportunity and actually give them the best shot to go and capture that market opportunity? So segmentation, that's the purpose of it, and that's what it actually drives. And then the outcomes of that, they're tied to longer term KPIs. So like I mentioned, we do this a lot around the annual planning process. It's usually the once a year event. And so what happens is, it focuses on improving your LTV to CAC ratio, your return on go to market, improve seller productivity, selling time, some of these like longer KPIs. And so that's really the purpose of segmentation. Like I said, we can definitely get into exactly like how it's done and the different components of it, because I do think they're two distinct components, and then bringing them together is what actually drives those outcomes.
Yeah, and let's dive into that in just a second. But I want to, tease apart a couple of things. When I think about a lot of these processes, I tend to think about, the inputs and outputs sort of upstream, downstream, right? And so you mentioned, downstream of this is your resource allocation and that sort of thing. And so I think as somebody thinks about territory a lot, I think about that kind of flows into how does this inform our territory designs and how are we putting, reps, whether it's in the field or named accounts or whatever. But it sounds like kind of implied there is that your ICP is sort of upstream of this. It's something you want to have defined before you start thinking about segmentation. So maybe just like click into that a little bit further. Like, what do you need to have figured out before you can start thinking about segmentation?
Yeah, I mean, we typically refine the ideal customer profile during segmentation. So it's a lot of the work that we do. Having your ideal customer profile defined beforehand will be great because, like you mentioned, it is an upstream thing. The ideal customer profile informs, where you're spending a lot of your marketing dollars. That's typically where most of the conversation is around, and typically the go-to-market function that gets the most use case out of the ideal customer profile. And obviously that will feed into territories and how they're balanced, which again I can talk about here in a second. But in terms of like actually like what you would need before segmentation is just like, I will say as a consultant, having nice clean data is a really big that's a big thing. You have that, we're in a really great spot already. But I think that just having good direction in terms of like, okay, next, like when we sit down, the main conversation we have is like, next year, who do we want to focus? Like what is the team that we're rolling in with? The structure of it. Segmentation can inform that stuff. But if we have a good idea as to like who we're going to be targeting next year, and even the skeleton of the ideal customer profile, that's pretty much all you're going to need to get started with segmentation, because segmentation really is the core input to all go to market initiatives. Like it is the first thing that I believe you need to start with, because it will help you optimize your territories, your quota and your compensation, your coverage model, your org design. It will impact everything. And so starting with segmentation is the key. You don't need much to get going, to be honest with you.
Well, you touched on the, I guess, third rail of go to market, which is data and data
Yeah.
quality, right? Like, that's always the lament, I guess, that I hear is like our data's not good enough, that sort of thing. I've written a lot about on the newsletter, a lot about the idea of your data is never going to be perfect, and pursuit of perfection is basically just saying I'm never going to do anything, right? And so I'm curious, when you think about somebody going into a segmentation process, what's the minimum? What do they need to have confidence in from a data perspective? What are the things they need to do from a data perspective, whether they're working with you at SBI or whether they're doing it internally, to feel reasonably good that they're making high quality decisions downstream of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the data that we do source for segmentation, comes from, third parties, because we do look at, when building the ideal customer profile and calculating the account potential, we take a look at firmographics and technographics. However, in order to go out and actually source those, we need just a solid customer cube. Really is just the primary foundation to it. And I think one of the biggest, it's fairly niche, but it has a lot of downstream implications, is like whether we're talking at the child level or we're talking at the parent level, right? And this has to do, again, with like your coverage model. If you have like a global account manager because you're managing a large Fortune 500 company, are they managing the different territories? Or are we talking at the child level? Do folks own individual locations that roll up under a single parent? And so having your customer cube organized in those fashions, all you need really is that list of accounts, the ARR, and then that's the foundation that you're going to need to start with it. If you have a great idea of your prospect based as well, that was super helpful. That will give us a good start so we can go out and try and find like accounts to map into that universe as well. Because like I said, we want to give the best picture possible of, what we typically equate to as the SAM. And so having those foundational data sets will get you started for sure.
Well, you touched the, I don't know, third and a half rail of data, which is hierarchy, specifically, right? That always comes in. And there's interesting, not to go too deep into the hierarchy, rabbit hole here, but you mentioned, we've talked about the coverage model, right?
Mhm.
As something that you then use segmentation as an input into. But one of the things, you just mentioned is like, are we thinking about reps covering, ultimate parents or like specific accounts within that? And so it's sort of a little bit of a, I don't know, recursive kind of thing where it's like, what do we think the coverage model is going to be, which might inform the data that we put into it. So how do you tease some of those dependencies apart? It's not a not a trick question, but
Yeah.
it's I feel like kind of comes up sometimes. Hypothesis of what's going on downstream.
No, absolutely. It's funny. I had a conversation not too long ago when we had this exact same decision that needed to be made to start the segmentation was, are we going to look at this at the child level, or are we going to look at this at the parent level? I think one of the key questions is, again, regions. What regions does your business span? Are we talking about international account owners that will have coordinated across the different regions, or is it typically it's localized? And that conversation can very much differ between a company that's based and your business is based in EMEA versus NORAM, because you have a lot of language differences, a lot of cultural differences in EMEA. And then America, it's more of a homogeneous model. So that's a huge question. Two is also just like the current number and skill level of your reps and your resources, your CSMs, your A's, and your AMs. If it's more focused on having those one-to-one relationships and we're playing a little bit more down market or in the mid market, we'd probably recommend going and doing this at the child account level. Usually, we're working with large enterprises that do have these large scale enablement programs. You have lots of resources and support are pooled. That's when we typically recommend doing it at the parent level, the more sophisticated organizations, if you will. Not a negative connotation, but just do you have the enablement to support global prioritization of your accounts and to go out and pursue them as well. So those are really the two main topics in the conversations we have when figuring out the hierarchy to pursue within segmentation.
Got it. Well, we kind of danced around this a little bit. Let's back up just a little bit and kind of lay out a segmentation process for me. What are the steps that an organization should go through to get from, okay, we're not sure what our segmentation is going to be, to like we feel pretty good about it. So walk me through what that should look like.
Yeah, for sure. So there's really two main components to account segmentation. You have your ideal customer profile, and then you have actually calculating the account potential. So the ideal customer profile, this is usually where orgs struggle the most, is what I see, because some folks think about it as a buyer persona, some folks think about it as more like a propensity to buy score, and it's not quite either. Really, it is a framework to describe the most attractive and the best fitting accounts for your solutions based on their firmographics and technographics. So the first step is to secure and lock in the ideal customer profile, which therefore you can then go and score all of your different accounts and how they align to that ideal customer profile framework. To actually set up the ideal customer profile, it's comprised of about 4 to 6 factors that you have. Again, technographic and firmographic. They can be budgetary metrics, size metrics, categorical metrics to say, hey, like looking at our historical data, and this is a lot of the analyses that we do, what types of accounts are we actually winning with and have we within the past? Is it within companies where their employees are between 25,000 and 50,000? Is it those that have high cloud maturity or low cloud maturity? There are all sorts of different factors that we take a look at, and we do run correlation analyses against ARR and product level ARR to say, hey, these factors strongly correlate with where you're winning today. Take a look at deal metrics and whatnot as well. And that will help you identify the 4 to 6 factors to say, hey, these combined together, if we can analyze where our different accounts fall and how they score against these firmographics, that's what we would describe as our ideal customer. They are best fit for our solutions. Now, I think important distinction here, and we have this conversation a lot, is that the ideal customer profile is more of a stagnant and long-term framework as opposed to something like a propensity to buy. Those are two different subjects, and I think that they are more effective independently than when they're merged together. And we could talk about that, but I think it's important for folks to ground. The ideal customer profile is a framework that we can adjust over time, but it more is a stagnant framework. Say, here are the firmographic and technographic factors. And so you select the 4 to 6 factors based on your deal metrics and your historical ARR and where you show you have the most success. And then again, we score accounts against that framework because within each factor, we divide them into what we call cohorts. So for example, I think that, employee count's an easy one to describe. We have our cohorts of 0 to 100, 100 to 1,000, 1,000 to 5,000, so on and so forth. And we take a look at your deal metrics and we say, okay, here's where you have the highest win rate. Here's where you have the shortest sales cycle time. And we basically have a bit of a formula that goes through and ranks each of those. And then those cohorts are defined and assigned a score relative to each other, determining what the factor is worth. I know that is a lot, but basically what it does is it allows you to say, like, let's say our employee count factor is worth 20. If an account is in the cohort of their employee count is between 1,000 and 5,000, they would receive a 15 out of 20 for that factor. You go through the other 4 to 6 factors. This one receives a 17 out of 20. This one receives a 23 out of 30, so on and so forth. And then what that will do is give you a score 0 to 100, and that is what we call the account score. And so this is one where it's usually we describe it as a mix of the art and the science, because we do take a look at your deal metrics, but it's important to define the ideal customer profile, and at least as I was talking about in the beginning, who we want to go and pursue, because it's, do you rely 100% on the data, or do we also want to infuse a bit of, this is where the business is going and this is where the business is headed? That's where a lot of our conversations around the ideal customer profile you start with, and then we go ahead and we run all the analyses that I was just mentioning. So the first step is the ideal customer profile.
So I gotta put on my RevOps and
Yeah,
data analyst hat for a second here, because
for
there's a
sure.
bunch of stuff packed in there that I think is easier said than done in a lot of cases, right? So let's start with the cohorting, right? So I
Mhm.
think that a lot of folks that I talk to who do their own, ICP scoring, their own segmentation work, right? It They start with that same kind of concept, and it sort of goes from, okay, here's my cohorts, and then I'm going to do a pivot table and kind of see what my like average win rates and stuff are in each of those cohorts, that kind of thing, right? So similar to what you're talking about, but there's a little bit of art and science involved in selecting the cohorts in the first place, because I've often found when I do this kind of analysis that you take sort of, okay, 1,000 to 5,000 or something like that, that could hide significant differences in the like 1,000 to 2,000 range, and then the 2,000 to 3,000 range. So, how do you actually select those cohorts in the first place? Like, what leads you to say what they should be?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I hate to say it with the answer. It totally depends as to like what factor and what type of factor you have. Using that example just to pull a thread through on it, like when we're looking at things like employee count, we'll take a look at ARR distribution. We will take a look at the distribution of accounts. Sometimes folks might think, oh, well, we'll want an even distribution, and I can set the cohorts. If I have 5 cohorts within that factor, it would be like 20% of my accounts, 20% of my accounts. It's not so much the case actually. And again, this depends on like where the business is going and where we actually want to focus. Because maybe we don't play in the enterprise space right now, and we're playing in the mid market to lower mid market or something along those lines. We wouldn't just want to group the enterprise space then into like one big bucket and basically give it a low score, and especially on deal metrics, we may want to actually split those out. So it's based on the distribution of your ARR and your accounts, and then also, again, a bit on where the business is headed. Ideally, the more granular we can split the cohorts where the business wants to focus, that's where we see the most success. For categorical factors, it's a bit easier, if we're talking about the types or the industry or whatnot. Those are fairly self-explanatory. But for the quantitative metrics, the more granular we can get, that's great. You can set as many cohorts as you would like, but you also don't want to have false precision as well. So that's why you want to look at the distributions and make sure you have appropriate end counts across the cohorts within your customer base to say, hey, this is a substantial cohort that we can analyze and have sufficient data to take a look at and actually score appropriately.
Well, and this may be it's trending towards the nerdiest conversation that we've had. It's awesome, but there's been some pretty nerdy conversations. Well, let me ask about the categorical data for a second, because let's say, I mean, industry is the classic categorical data, right?
Yeah.
But industry hides a lot of complexity. If I just use, like, say, top level NAICS codes or whatever, I've got the classic like technology or business solutions or whatever that I'm grouping people in together. How do you decide like what level of granularity you need to get to, even in something that, seems like it's a sort of simple categorical thing? Because you are probably not going to do equally well in all quote unquote technology companies. So how do you think about solving for that?
Yeah. Yeah, a couple of different ways to do it. So one of them, industry is a great example. It's very general, right? And typically solutions are geared towards certain industries in general. So, if you sell something within, the desk workforce, you're probably not going to be selling that same solution to manufacturing companies. So there's a bit of like the obvious that's within there. And one approach is that, okay, we're not necessarily going to break out those industries that aren't typically applicable to our solutions. And we're going to focus on splitting the top 5 to 6 to 7 industries into sub industries. And that will give you a great bit of granularity there. Another layer I've seen thrown on top of that, which you can do for other, ideal customer profile factors, but I do see this a lot done with industry specifically, is you can effectively combine it with another categorical factor that matters, right? So within the industry, right, like what makes an industry what's the difference? What's the different drivers between the sub industry? A great example of this is country, and we just did this for the last segmentation that I was a part of. It was an international company, so the conversations that we're having with, for example, banks in Switzerland versus banks in the United States are different because the regulations are different. Factoring, those conversations are different from the ones that are in Germany than the ones that maybe are in South America. What we can do is we can actually combine those factors. And I think the simplest visualization is like a large 2 by 2 table that creates a scoring matrix. And
All right, welcome back. Where we left off was you're talking about combining categorical factors, industry plus countries.
yeah, 100%. So, like I said, when the ideal customer profile, when thinking about where do we actually get into that granular level of detail, because the industry is a very broad area, everybody always is going to take a look at that. Like I said, we can overlay that with a second factor, and so it creates like a combination factor. So we can essentially create a large scoring matrix that will show the hotspots. And so we like to think of it as a differentiation factor will sit across the top, so we can understand within the tech industry what actually is going to differentiate that across, again, certain, it could be regions, it could be even by that employee count, could be used as a secondary factor to overlay it. That's what usually gives the better level of granularity across the factors.
Got it. And then, so I know we've kind of gone real deep on ICP here. We're getting
Yeah,
to the
for
rest of the
sure.
piece here in a second, but I wanted to ask a little bit about the actual like calculation of that scoring. All right. So what's in that matrix you described for kind of combining factors, or y'all need to reveal any SBI secret sauce or anything, but maybe just help us understand a little bit about how one actually goes about figuring out that score. You mentioned like maybe normalizing it so it's some value out of 20 or something like that, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, definitely. The first step would actually be taking the final set of, again, so we recommend somewhere between 4 to 6 factors. That's usually you find the sweet spot. You want the total of those factors to equal 100 in terms of the points that they're worth. So we may assign one 20, another 30, another 10, 5, 15, so on and so forth. You just want the total to be 100. So that's what one factor is worth. Within each individual factor, like I mentioned, we split it into cohorts. This is where what we call the subweights actually in the calculation actually occurs. So the subweights for the cohorts, the max value it can have will be the value of what that factor is actually worth. So if we assign it 20 points, the highest subweight across any of the cohorts will be 20 points. The others are scored relatively to that. And like I said, that's done through a couple of different analyses. So we take a look at, we're going to pick about 4 to 6 metrics, is how I like to describe it, to calculate those subweights. We typically look at deal metrics. So we look at your cycle time. We'll take a look at average deal size, maybe percent ARR, GRR even. There's a couple of different metrics that you could do. What's the most applicable and you think to the business, I should say. And so we have that data and we will map in all the firmographic and technographic data to the opportunity data based on what we've selected for the 4 to 6 factors within the ICP. That allows us to say, hey, what's our win rate within the employee band of 1,000 to 5,000? What is the percent of ARR that sits within accounts that is 1,000 to 5,000? We take a look at cycle time for deals across those accounts as well. And so for each individual cohort within each individual factor, you basically calculate whatever those deal metrics are you want to take a look at. The next step would be to actually rank them to each other. So let's say I have 10 different cohorts because I've split employee count into 10 different like bands that I want to take a look at. I would say, okay, the number one rank is the one between 1,000 to 5,000. The second rank would be between 5,000 to 10,000 in terms of how they perform across each of those metrics. You can rank them by specific metric, and so you have like this one scored second out of 10 here, third out of 10 here, fourth out of 10 here, and then eventually you can come up with a total rank based on the average of how they score. That will then allow you to have a prioritized rank of 1 through 10. Hey, here's how they score across these or excuse me, how they perform across these metrics relative to each other. And then what we do is you can essentially just multiply it by the weight of the factor itself. That will give you a prorated subweight for each of those cohorts within itself. And so you do that for all your different factors, and that allows you to have for each cohort across each factor, you can then take a look at your accounts and say, hey, it scores a 15 out of 20 if it falls into the 1,000 to 5,000 employee count. It's a manufacturing is a cohort with an industry, and we know that score is a 23 out of 30. And so you can do that across all the factors to ultimately score the accounts.
Got it. I think that combining those factors to build up the subweights effectively is something that I think I see a lot of people not do. Right? They kind of they fixate on one particular thing. Like companies between 1,000 and 5,000 employees, like we've got the highest win rate there. So that's the best group, right? That's the cohort. And I think that I like the way you're putting this together because it allows you to do a much more balanced assessment. So that's the ICP. So we got an ICP score, right? And I like what you called out earlier, which is I think really, really important. And I'm not going to be any controversy from me on what you said, which is like, I think the fit score, the ICP score should be independent of propensity to buy or anything related to timing. I think people get really excited about signals and things like that today, and they're very focused on who's in market right now, those kinds of things, which is not the exact same thing as propensity to buy. But it's I think what happens a lot of times is people get fixated not on is it a good account in the first place, but it's just, are they alive, right? Or do you going to buy something? So separating those two allows you to like balance how you're making a play with those. But
Yes.
let's keep going here. So we've got the ICP, we've got all our accounts scored based on their relevance to our ICP. So what's next?
Yeah. So after we go ahead and we're able to score all the accounts, next is the second component of segmentation, which is calculating account potential. So similar to the like discrepancy, or I should say the warning in terms of like ICP, something similar along to account potential. So account potential, the idea is to estimate how much at the account level each customer or prospect can spend on your solution. You can calculate this as one single number across the account, or you could do this at the individual product level and then sum those across to get total potential. What this mostly aligns to is your SAM, as I was mentioning earlier. So it's not necessarily a TAM, because if we do this and calculate account potential across all your customers and prospects, it's relative to the accounts that are in the database. Your TAM is all across the world. It's usually done from a tops down perspective. This is strictly a bottoms up. So it does align more to a SAM because it captures, hey, if every dollar could be spent from this account on this solution, here's what it would be. But it doesn't have to do with, what is actually obtainable, which is the SOM. So I think that's an important frame of reference for people to take a look at when thinking about potential. So we have two primary ways to calculate account potential at the account level. And we either do that through a frontier analysis or we can do it by a P times Q. When talking about a frontier analysis, it's based on the historical top customer spend as a percent of their financials. And what I mean by that is we take a look at a certain financial metric. And this also could be a firmographic metric, something like their HR budget or their IT budget. Typically, though, easiest example to explain is their revenue as a company as a whole, right? And so we can take a look at their spend as a percent of their revenue, for example, and that would be the frontier metric is what we typically describe it as. And so we can find that, and it could be ARR per employee that they have. Like I said, it could be ARR as a percent of their IT budget. And so we pick like a financial, and you can pick the different financial based on different products if you're doing it at the product level, based on what correlates the most with that product, in terms of like HR, IT budget, because it's the IT department is actually spending their money on that solution to go ahead and bring in house. So you take a look at the frontier metric and you calculate it across all your accounts. And then what happens is we find the 80th percentile of that spend, right? And so what it does is it creates a benchmark spend effectively for your customers and prospects. Now, one important thing to note is that it's not just an 80th percentile of just taking like all the accounts and grouping them together and finding it. What we do beforehand is we actually split the customers and the prospects into cohorts as we describe them, right? So we take a categorical metric and a size metric, basically to assign, and group the customers into logical categories to say, hey, look, it's the size metrics are very important because your smaller accounts who have, in the lower mid-market space aren't going to be able to spend as much as enterprise. And so we group them into cohorts and then find the 80th percentile within each cohort, right? And so the categorical metric, we typically see something like industry is very common because what industry you're in can depend on how much you actually spend on a certain solution. And so within each cohort, we calculate the 80th percentile, and we effectively use that as a benchmark for the other accounts within that cohort. Where the difference is not that all 10 accounts, let's say, that are in a cohort have the exact same benchmark. It would be relative to the firmographic metric they have. So, for example, if you did ARR spend per employee, we would find the 80th percentile, and then we'd be able to multiply that by that account's actual employee count. And so that allows us to get a very granular view, like I said, at the account and even at the product level of how much they could potentially spend on the product itself. And so we're able to do this across all customers and prospects. And this gives you the equivalent of, we like to talk about it again as your SAM. So that's how account potential is calculated.
So I'm curious, anytime I hear like a constant, like 80%, right? I'm curious why that, like where does that, what does that flow from?
Yeah. I mean, it originates from the Pareto principle, right? I mean, generally 80-20, we see that across a lot of the work that we do at SBI. However, we have seen some variation from that. It's typically what we would recommend just because we do believe anything above that, you're really going to get your outliers, especially if you have like very, very high AR concentration. So we found the 80th percentile to be the sweet spot. I have seen situations where if there is very, very high ARR concentration, that number still may be skewed. And so what we could do is we could take a look and exclude the outliers that are either super high or super low, and then calculate that 80th percentile. And so it all depends on, again, your ARR concentration or where all your revenue is concentrated. If it is very high, I would recommend going with the outlier approach and cutting that before calculating the frontier. But the 80% seems to be the way we can actually estimate conservatively. And this is where it lands most across the clients that we have.
So one thing that I want to touch on here, when you start slicing your data into these cohorts, you run the risk, and you kind of hinted at it earlier, but you run the risk of maybe slicing kind of thin, right? So maybe I've got 5 samples, right, in this particular cohort. How do you think about trying to adjust for, confidence in the data, right? So if I have one customer who fits this particular cohort and, their 80% is X, I can't really trust it as much as the cohort where I have 500 customers. So how do you try to compensate for that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And so the cohorts that we set for the ideal customer profile are different than the cohorts that we will set for account potential, right? And so the target number that we're going for is at least an N count of 10 within the account potential cohorts, just so when we do take that 80th percentile, it isn't calculating it from 1, 2, or 3 accounts. You're not going to get an accurate reading there. And so this is where it does come into some workshopping with our clients to say, hey, what's a categorical and a size metric that we can group logically so we do have sufficient end count so we can get an accurate data point. When we don't, we do tend to find that the results can be skewed because we will then default to taking a look at, hey, what is it then for accounts that are in this employee tier within this revenue band? You just lose a bit of that granularity when you don't group the cohorts where there's enough end count to pull a correct 80th percentile.
Okay. And when you kind of introduced that, talked about the frontier, you also mentioned P times Q. Could you just
Yeah.
clarify what you meant by that?
Yeah, for sure. So the P times Q in general, that my sentiment is it's a bit more of an accurate way to estimate account potential. The caveat is though, it works best when you have a user or, per user pricing model. And so it's exactly what it is. We try and estimate the quantity that we can sell based on the number of employees that we have, right? If you have the per user pricing, and you try and estimate within that employee base how many we can actually go ahead and sell to. And then we have the price, which is just the price of the actual solution. And so we see a lot of account potential calculate the product level with this. And like I said, it can give us a much more granular level of account potential to actually say, hey, this is more aligned to our SOM. However, again, it does assume that everybody within that estimated quantity bucket can actually purchase that product. We all know that may not be the case because I mean, the reality is sometimes people may share user keys and whatnot, so you may not capture all of it, but that's how P times Q calculated. Think of it as if you're selling office chairs to office workers. You'd like to understand how many office workers there are, multiply that by the price of the chair, and that's how we come up with the total potential for P times Q.
Got it. So you calculate all this for your existing customers, and then it's just a matter of applying the formula that you come up with from this down to all of your, I guess your SAM essentially. So all the prospects that you know about. And so at the end of the day, once you've done all this process, I now have each account with an ICP score and an account potential score. Is that the right way to think about this?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
So then, what's next?
Yeah, this is really where the magic happens. Everyone, okay, great. I have these two scores. Now, do I want to do with them? I understand how much they can spend. Segmentation, again, it's all about going back to what I mentioned up front. The prioritization versus the pursuit. Taking these two metrics, we can then go ahead and create prioritization models, which will then inform coverage and all these things that we were just talking about. So, easiest way to think about it is a 2x2, right? So we create two prioritization models, one for customers and then one for prospects. For customers, we have your current spend, think of that as on your x-axis, and then we have your white space, which is their calculated potential minus their ARR. And what can we do is we can create a scatter plot, right? And so this allows us to bucket customers in what we call the road model. We have our retain, our opportunistic, acquire, and develop customers. And what it does, when you take a look at that scatter plot, you can see which customers you're very highly penetrated with, those where you have a lot of white space and they're not spending as much as they could, and those that where they are spending a lot and they're our top customers, but they also have a lot of room for growth. And so this is, I think, where it really clicks, for our clients to say, okay, now we can understand what coverage we need to apply to these accounts based on where they fall on these prioritization models. And so we could talk a little bit about how it gets into tiering, because when you're actually creating your segments, you want to ensure that the right skilled resources, your best skilled resources are covering those that are in the enterprise segment, which are those we see typically in the top right. And then those that you might send to your digital motion or have a very, pool to resource, low touch motion, those would be the ones that are in the bottom left of that scatter plot. So that's how we actually put them on the prioritization models. It's a little different for prospects because we do use that account score and we take a look at their white space. So the account score being on the X and the white space being on the Y, we take a look and say, hey, we just want to focus on the prospects that are all the way in the top right. Those are the ones that we actually want to focus and distribute for seller assignment. All the others that don't fall into the very top right corner of the scatter plot, those are the ones we would send to a reactive or digital touch. Really, we don't even really want to send those to low touch. We don't want our resources, pursuing accounts that don't have a lot of white space and don't score well in regards to the ICP. So that's where bringing those two potential and the account score metrics together that's what allows for the prioritization.
So just to play that back, make sure I'm following the road model, the retain, opportunistic, acquire, develop, like that model is really about what quadrant they fit in. It's not about the quadrant represents it, but the quadrant they fit in this kind of two-dimensional plot of what they're spending a day and what they could be spending. All right. And that's how we think about the customer side of things. But for the prospect side of the world, what we really are thinking about is how good of a fit are they, and then how much could they spend? And that top right quadrant becomes like, that's where we spend all our time. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. Right. And I mean, it goes back to, again, it's not the propensity to buy, it's just how attractive that account is based on historicals. These are the types of prospects where we have the highest chance of winning based on who we've won with in the past. And they also have a lot to spend, right? And that's where, again, it's all about prioritization. These are where we want our new logo hunters. That's where we want them focused, is on this small subset of prospects. And we find anyway that typically within the top right, we aim for somewhere less than 10% of the prospects within the universe. We'd ideally like them to see holding somewhere between I've seen as low as 25%, but typically it's around 50% of your potential you will find is sitting in that top right hand corner within just 5 to 10% of your prospects. That's when we know we've really hit the jackpot, and we can say, okay, we're this is where again the impact show of like, good return on your investment when it comes to your marketing dollars, is having those new logo hunters and investing all that money into those prospects that are in the top right hand.
So when you think about, all right, now we've got a pool of accounts, like for our customers that we know we have a certain type of service model we want to target, right? And then we have that kind of top right pool of accounts that we want to go spend our time on, right? How do we think about operationalizing that? And so, that starts, I imagine, playing into territories and marketing spend and all those kinds of things. So what happens from there?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, I have this data. We have the prioritized list of accounts. We're able to segment them across where we go do with it now. So, the segmentation model that we typically hand off to folks in a large database, we typically would hand that off to the RevOps team and they would internalize that. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is, okay, so now I can put into my CRM how an account scores on the account score, and then also how much they have to spend. As you can imagine, it's probably not a great idea to give your sellers that much information, because you get those that are saying this is a bad account. I don't agree with this number. And again, I mean, like segmentation, it's a tool, right? And to direct focus, I wouldn't necessarily look at it as every cent is that's your source of truth, right? It's going to be directional as an extent. But how to actually operationalize that is specifically when it comes to territories is actually balancing your territories, right? So we can take a look at how much potential, depending how we organize accounts and assign them to each sellers, how much potential is within a given territory. What's the average account score? This will allow you to create actual equitable opportunity within each territory across each segment. And so therefore, you wouldn't necessarily want to plug in your CRM and show this data. You would be able to say, hey, and talk to your teams and say, hey, look, we've gone through and done the prioritization exercise. We can confirm that these are the priority prospects that we want to take a look at. And we can also confirm that there's equitable opportunity across territories. As I'm sure it's something that everyone we're going to be able to talk about and folks are going to say all the time, is that there's not enough potential in my territory. I'm tapped out. This will allow you to say, hey, there is equitable opportunity and equitable potential across them.
So when we think about that, like whatever that territory model might be, right? And I'm harping on territory because like this is, I think, how ultimately we end up like deploying this out to reps and saying who's responsible for what, right? So it's sort of the service model that goes into play. So, the questions are gonna kind of come in like, okay, given this pool of accounts, do I think about my territory model as being like a traditional geographic model and then try to balance like that way? Do I think about it as verticals? Do I think about it as named accounts? Like all the different kind of options that you have there. What can the segmentation effort and output do to help you decide what that coverage model should look like? And how do those things play in each other?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's the best way to operationalize it, is taking a look at, do we have enough, to use your example, potential within each vertical to actually verticalize our sellers? Do we only see that there's enough potential within certain regions within specific verticals? And so if we're constantly finding that there isn't enough potential, there's not quite enough prospects with high account scores to cut it that granular by region, by vertical and whatnot, that's when we'd suggest, okay, maybe we shouldn't go with the verticalized model and we should just go with the regional model. So you want to make sure, if you are going to roll with those, depending what level and how many cuts of like region and vertical you're going to do, you want to take a look at, do we have enough potential? That's definitely the number one metric to take a look at. And then also, like, do we have enough prospects? For example, if you're designing your AE territories, do you have enough prospects that are scoring high enough and have enough account potential based on have enough account potential that we've actually produced? So that all goes into quotas and compensation too, making sure that there's enough potential for them to go and hit their quota based on current win rates.
Well, and I actually wanted to touch on comp here as well, right? Like, do you find that your clients are able to take this, account potential, sum that up across whatever, the territories they design are, and they're using that directly to say, okay, this is the potential in this territory. That's this multiple of quota. We believe that this is enough for reps. So how do they start using this in developing a comp plan?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so when thinking about designing your comp plans, thinking about your accelerators, for example, for your AEs, is there enough potential for them in doing your cost modeling, your Monte Carlo to stress test it? You know, is there enough potential at our current win rates for them to achieve that 150% quota if things were to assume on the positive side, where they would actually be able to receive that multiplier, right? Because I think one of every seller again is going to complain that their quota is a little bit too high. Maybe they don't get paid enough. That's going to happen. But what this allows it to do is say, hey, when we're running these scenarios in terms of if you hit your number and these win rates that we can apply based on the territory, the number of accounts, looking at our win rates by the average ICP score, for example, that'll allow you to create different scenarios to say, what number will our reps hit? You can estimate their productivity, which obviously is a huge input to the cost models to say, will they be able to achieve these accelerators? What should we put as our decelerators if we're finding out that we as a company are spending too much money? And so it's the primary reason I've seen it used is an input for those scenarios to understand how much you as a company will spend and then how much will your AEs earn. And that can go into the retention attrition conversation alone right there.
Got it. Okay. Just really quickly, you mentioned stress testing, like with using a
Mm.
model. I'd love to hear just a little bit more about what you see folks do with that.
Yeah. So a lot of it is based on, like I said, the multipliers and, maybe how they're structuring even something like multi-year deals. What are we actually incentivizing? So going back within the opportunity data, how many multi-years or deals are we selling? Is this something that we need to prioritize more so we can create stickier revenue for as a company? And so depending on how you're actually shaping your compensation plans and what types of accelerators for different products or whatnot, you can go ahead and model hey, if we increase our cross sell by 20% within this vertical, within this region, here's what it's going to yield for productivity for us. And if that's distributed among these 6 sellers, how does that turn out within their comp plans? And so there's a whole lot of companies and I should say clients want to look at different types of scenarios. Again, whether they sell multi-year deals or if two companies have come together as a merger, if there's an increase in cross sell. And so we will build those types of factors and variables into the model to pressure test.
Cool. Okay. Well, let's we've gone really deep on the analytical components, and we've mentioned a few times that maybe there's a subjective element, there's an art to this, right? So one of the things that I wanted to just touch on here is when we think about the softer side of this, the human side of this, trying to manage this process, there is a cross-functional element. There's different opinion. There's also communicating the reps, all of those types of things. Maybe kind of briefly, like what are some things that you need to be thinking about that aren't just the analytical pieces to make sure this process goes well?
Yeah, no, great question. Two things that come down to it is one, during the segmentation process, having that stakeholder map of who we need to have conversations and when. And then two, is it a change management program set from the very start, not just for segmentation and for the ideal customer profile, but depending what downstream go-to-market initiatives you're also working on, having change management plans and set up for territories, quota comp, so on and so forth. Starting with the stakeholder map that we talk about, it's the very first thing we talk about when it comes to segmentation as well. Within that very first couple of days that we're standing up is from different departments, being marketing, customer success, or those two are automatically. We also typically bring finance in at the same time as well, particularly when compensation is involved. But bringing in those leads from those other functions to come in and say, here is where something like the ideal customer profile is headed so marketing can understand and be a part of those conversations. Because typically the ideal customer profile is where there's the most room for the human element to it, the art side, adjusting it to say this is where the business is going, this is where we want to invest our marketing dollars. And the change management for the reps themselves is being able to document all the decisions that are made along the way to actually build an effective rollout plan for this once it actually hits the field.
Got it. Well, and one question I have then is what are common problems that people run into and what are some things to do about those maybe so they don't happen in the first place?
Yeah, no, I think I've already hit on them already. I would say, besides data, the difference between the prioritization and the pursuit around the ideal customer profile is where I see the most contention, right? I think that once folks see how the data turns out, especially if we haven't done an ideal customer profile before, it can be surprising, the results, right? And so it can be, is this really where we want to go? Depending, our FY26 strategy, for example, a lot of conversations, we've historically won here in the past. Is that where we want to keep rolling going forward? And like I said, the difference between that and the propensity to buy model, you can do great work within the ICP, but if you operationalize it as this is a propensity to buy, which we'll take a look at more short-term characteristics, not long-term and stagnant firmographics, that's where you see the most issues. So I see a lot of issues with deployment and the use of the ideal customer profile. And then with the account potential, one thing to note too is just because you see your account potential may be 10 billion, it doesn't mean you get 50 or 100x your business just because it has that, right? Like there is the element to, again, this is directional. It allows you to prioritize. The ability to capture that market opportunity comes in the pursuit, like the enablement that you're providing sellers, like where if those marketing dollars are actually being put to where we see those high CP account scores. And so I think being able to recognize that it is a bit of a longer term model that should be refreshed annually. I would say even quarterly. I would recommend like updating it with data to see if it's actually working if you deploy it within that given year. I think if folks try and update it too much and try and re-roll around and then reassign territories, that's where it loses its effectiveness because that's not the purpose of it. So those are the big challenges I see with the segmentation model itself.
So one final question that I wanted to ask here is a challenge I see a lot of people who do any kind of data analysis, and that includes RevOps. It includes people who are dedicated to data analysis. It probably includes you. You're often dealing with levels of uncertainty and kind of probabilities that are embedded in the analysis that you're doing, right? Like there's a set of assumptions that go into it. And like you've said, a couple of times, this is directional, but it's not perfect. Every model is a flawed version of the real world. But you're often dealing with stakeholders who maybe kind of taking the data literally, right? Like you mentioned, like well, it says it's going to be $10 billion. Well, okay, that's a $10 billion account. So how have you found that you can effectively communicate the uncertainty or a little bit of the like probabilistic nature of these types of analyses to stakeholders who may not be super familiar with thinking like that?
Yeah, I think it does start with central ownership. Having the team, the operations, the RevOps team actually own the model and the data that's coming from the model before deploying into the organization. Once you allow it to be a free for all, that's where you get a lot of folks come in and they're able to make their, and try and interpret what the model is actually telling them and go apply it in the wrong use case. In terms of actually conveying that communication, I mean, it does come from the start of stating that, look, this is a directional model and it will tell you where you need to focus, but it won't be down to that last cent. And so the use cases of and the impact that it actually has, again, is like those marketing dollars, where are they being put? Your capacity and your coverage recommendations, because then we didn't necessarily talk about capacity yet, but how many sellers, how many CSMs do you need to support these accounts based on what is within each segment when we plot them on the prioritization model. We like to do a lot of comparison between bottoms up and tops down. Like I said, the segmentation model is bottoms up. We definitely want to sanity check it though with the tops down. If we're doing our headcount planning and we're growing, how many SOs do we think we're going to need within the year? Clients typically come with these before we engage within the segmentation model, right? And then we're able to verify it with the bottoms up. So it's that sanity check with the tops down, along with having central ownership of the model, where we see that it's more of a, I don't want to say a general deployment of the model, but you don't get folks taking it and running it with as the exact source of truth all across the organization, because that's when chaos spreads and things can get a little bit out of hand.
Well, you brought up something I can't help resist asking about because it is a piece we haven't really covered, which is capacity, right? And so I'd
Hmm.
love to hear real quick before we wrap up here. It's an awesome conversation, but before we wrap up, how do you apply this to your capacity model and not just your comp and all of that sort of thing? They're obviously intimately related, but curious.
Yeah, no, certainly. And segmentation is a direct input to the capacity models that we are taking a look at. So, in terms of capacity models, we have through the segmentation, you will have your prospects and your customers by segment. You will have by region, if you have like a verticalized model too, by industry. And you can take a look at and group the customers within enterprise that are within EMEA, for example, using coverage ratio or benchmark coverage ratios, whether that's an account or per ARR coverage ratios. If you're looking at CSMs, you can then say, hey, if we have 50 accounts within the enterprise space, and we think our coverage ratio is 1 to 3, 1 to 5, 1 to 10, depending what growth stage your business is. We're going to need X number of A's within this space. We currently have 6, so maybe we have a deficit of 1. Whatever the case may be. So that's where the capacity model comes into play. So you can do the bottoms up, saying, here's how many accounts, here's the ARR, here's the white space and potential. You can take a look at, hey, maybe we need to reallocate some resources, right? Whether that's between different regions or between segments, to ensure that there is enough white space per seller, because that's what you don't want. You don't want a region where you only have 100 accounts and the coverage ratio is 1 to 50 and you have 5 to 6 to 7 sellers, because then there's not going to be enough go get for them to secure.
Right. Okay. Well, Grant, this has been awesome. A lot of really specific and practical stuff in this conversation. I really appreciate you sharing everything, and yeah, excited to be able to share this with folks. So thanks a lot for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. Hey, this is a great conversation, and hopefully we'll be speaking soon on some more work together.
All right, awesome. And where can folks find SBI and get some help from folks like you?
That's right. Go check us out on LinkedIn. We're SBI Growth. You can check out our website at sbigrowth.com as well. Like I said, during Q4, it's a crazy time. So we have lots of folks coming to us. So if you feel like you're having some of these issues and some of these problems we're talking about resonate with you, feel free to reach out to us as well.
All right. Thanks a lot, Grant.
Take care, Ace.